All right, so today we're going to dive into a story
Okay.
about an encounter between Shaq and an elderly woman named Mrs. Margaret.
Interesting.
And it all takes place in a grocery store.
Okay.
Now, you might think you know where this is going,
Right.
but trust me, this one takes a few pretty unexpected turns.
Okay.
It really makes you think about how bias can pop up in even the most ordinary situations.
Yeah, those everyday places where we don't expect it, you know?
Totally.
It's kind of fascinating how, like, a mundane setting,
Yeah.
like a grocery store, can become this backdrop
Yeah.
for such a, complex interaction. It's not some, big dramatic headline-grabbing event.
Right.
It's just a slice of everyday life.
Right.
And then these deeper issues bubble up to the surface.
Okay, so let's paint a picture here.
Yeah.
It's a sunny afternoon.
All right.
Shaq's just doing his grocery shopping.
Okay.
He's keeping it casual, T-shirt and jeans.
Okay.
But, Shaq, that watch
Oh, yeah.
is probably worth more than my car.
Well, and that detail about the watch, I think, is more than just a fun fact,
Right.
It speaks to the fact that
Yeah.
despite his fame and fortune, Shaq is choosing to be there
Right.
in that very normal setting.
Right.
Just like anyone else.
Right, totally.
Yeah.
And then we have Mrs. Margaret,
Okay.
an elderly woman
Okay.
using a cane
Right.
and pushing a shopping cart. That sounds like it's seen better days.
You know those squeaky wheels?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that the initial impression of frailty, is important.
Yeah.
It plays into how we perceive her later actions.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Because we often associate age with vulnerability, and it kind of shapes our expectations.
Totally. Okay, so they cross paths in the cereal aisle.
Oh, the cereal aisle.
Of all places. And Mrs. Margaret, kind of curtly asks Shaq to move so she can reach something.
Okay.
Now, Shaq, being Shaq, steps aside with a smile.
Right.
But then Mrs. Margaret mutters something under her breath
Oh, boy.
about standards and how Shaq doesn't seem to belong there.
Well, that's where things start to get really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because that comment, seemingly insignificant as it might be, is actually like a classic example of a microaggression,
Right.
It might seem subtle, it might seem disguised as just a complaint about the store or whatever, but it's loaded with implicit bias.
Right.
And these kinds of microaggressions, even if they're unintentional, can have a real cumulative effect on people.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Exactly. It's that idea that you wouldn't think one paper cut would do that much damage. Right.
But over time, they add up.
Yeah.
And in this case,
Yeah.
it lays the groundwork
Yeah.
for a much bigger confrontation.
So Shaq could have just ignored the comment,
Right.
but you can just sense the tension building.
Yeah, you could feel it.
He stays calm, but you can tell her words have stung.
Oh, yeah.
And that decision, I think, to remain composed despite the provocation is key to understanding how the situation unfolds.
It speaks volumes, I think, about his character and his ability to control his immediate reactions.
And unfolded does rather dramatically.
Here we go.
Shaq's about to leave the aisle when Mrs. Margaret suddenly yells for security.
Oh, wow.
Demanding that Shaq be removed from the store.
No way.
Can you imagine being there?
Oh, God.
Everyone's staring, totally in shock.
Frozen.
And this escalation is significant.
It's a huge shift.
Right.
Because she's gone from
this subtle bias to like a very public display.
Yeah.
She's trying to use authority to enforce her discriminatory views.
And then Mrs. Margaret really drops a bomb.
Oh, no.
She yells for security to send him back to Africa.
Whoa.
It's just blatant racism.
Yeah, that's
And you can practically feel the air thicken the impact of her words on Shaq and everyone else.
the whole atmosphere changes.
It's palpable.
That outburst is really the climax of the story, I think.
Yeah.
It reveals the depth of her prejudice and the casual cruelty with which she uses it.
Right.
And that phrase, send him back,
Right.
is particularly loaded. It evokes a long history of rhetoric used to dehumanize and ostracize people of color.
Right.
This isn't just about her personal feelings. It connects to a much larger and uglier historical context.
It's a gut punch, honestly.
Yeah.
But what's remarkable is how Shaq responds.
Yeah.
He doesn't yell back. It doesn't get defensive.
Yeah.
He looks right at Mrs. Margaret.
Wow.
And calmly but firmly asserts his right to be there.
It's powerful.
Just like anyone else.
Yeah.
And this is where I think we see Shaq's composure and eloquence in full force.
Yeah, his true character shining through.
He refuses to be defined by her prejudice.
Right.
And chooses to engage with her on a human level.
Exactly.
It's a powerful statement. He's not letting her diminish his humanity.
And it's interesting because he talks about, being a son, a friend, a hardworking member of the community, emphasizing that his skin color doesn't change any of that.
Right. And then he does something I wouldn't have expected.
What's that?
He expresses sadness, not anger.
Oh, wow.
At her outdated views.
That's a really interesting choice.
Yeah.
Because it shows the emotional toll of prejudice while also inviting Mrs. Margaret to consider the impact of her words.
Yeah. Right.
It's a subtle but powerful way of highlighting the human cost of her actions.
It's like he's appealing to a better version of herself.
Yeah, exactly.
But Shaq doesn't stop there.
Oh, no, he doesn't.
He takes it even further.
Okay.
And connects with Mrs. Margaret on a personal level.
All right.
He mentions his own grandmother.
Oh, wow.
Someone he clearly loves and respects deeply.
Yeah.
And asks Mrs. Margaret to think about the legacy she wants to leave behind.
That's a heavy question.
He asks her to imagine how her actions would be perceived by younger generations.
So he's appealing to her sense of family.
Exactly.
And shared humanity.
Right.
It's a clever strategy because it shifts the focus away from the immediate conflict and encourages her to reflect on the bigger picture.
Right.
He's essentially asking her, is this how you want to be remembered?
Right.
What kind of example are you setting?
Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah.
And you can feel it. The entire atmosphere shifts.
Attention breaks.
Mrs. Margaret starts to crumble.
Oh, wow.
Tears well up in her eyes.
Okay.
And she admits her mistake.
Yeah.
Offering Shaq a heartfelt apology.
This apology is a pivotal moment, you know?
Yeah.
Her demeanor softens, suggesting a genuine recognition of her wrongdoing.
Yeah.
The emotional weight of the moment is palpable.
Absolutely.
What do you say?
The store erupts in applause.
Wow.
And Shaq, being the incredibly gracious person he is, accepts her apology.
Okay.
Emphasizing the importance of learning from our mistakes.
Shaq's acceptance of the apology really completes a transformation of the encounter.
Right.
He models forgiveness and emphasizes the potential for growth and understanding.
Yeah.
It shows that even in the face of such blatant prejudice, reconciliation is possible.
It's like this tense, charged situation completely dissipates.
It just melts away.
Mrs. Margaret leaves with a warm smile.
Nice.
And the story spreads like wildfire through the community.
Of course.
Sparking conversations about compassion, forgiveness, and the power of choosing grace over anger.
And the story's impact goes beyond that individual encounter. It becomes this catalyst for broader reflection on societal attitudes and the importance of challenging prejudice at every level.
It's a powerful reminder that these kinds of encounters don't always have to end in anger and division.
Yeah.
There's a real opportunity for growth and understanding.
Exactly.
But it takes conscious effort from both sides.
Absolutely. And this is where we really start to unpack what this story means, you know. Yeah. On the surface, it's easy to focus on Shaq's incredible composure.
Oh, yeah.
He was faced with outright racism.
Right.
But he never lost his cool.
Right.
Instead, he chose to educate and engage, turning a hostile situation into a teachable moment.
Shaq's behavior is a textbook example.
It really is.
Of emotional intelligence in action. He recognized the emotions welling up.
Yeah.
But didn't let them control his actions.
Right.
He consciously chose a path of empathy and understanding, which ultimately diffused the situation and opened the door for reconciliation.
It really makes you think, you know,
Yeah.
We always have a choice in how we respond to challenging situations.
Right.
Do we react with anger and escalate things?
Right.
Or do we try to find a more constructive path?
Right.
One that promotes dialogue and understanding.
And it's not always easy.
No.
Especially when faced with such blatant prejudice.
Yeah.
But Shaq's response shows us what's possible.
Exactly. And this brings us to the second takeaway.
Okay.
The importance of addressing our own biases. Mrs. Margaret's initial prejudice might have been unconscious, but it had real-world consequences.
Yeah.
Her words were hurtful and discriminatory.
Right.
And they could have easily led to a much worse outcome.
It's a sobering reminder.
Yeah, it is.
That we all have biases, whether we're aware of them or not.
We do.
We have a responsibility to examine those beliefs and challenge the ones rooted in prejudice or stereotypes.
Right. It's an ongoing process of self-reflection and education.
Absolutely.
We have to be willing to learn and grow, even when it's uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah. And Shaq's decision to engage with Mrs. Margaret, to treat her as a human being worthy of respect, is what ultimately led to her change of heart.
Right. He didn't just shut her down or dismiss her.
Right.
He invited her to see things from a different perspective.
And that's where the real power of this story lies.
Yeah, I agree.
It shows us that even deep-seated prejudices can be challenged and overcome.
It's possible.
Through compassion dialogue and genuine listening.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity, even in the midst of conflict.
And think about the broader context here.
Right.
We live in a world where these types of encounters are increasingly common.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Social media, political polarization, it all contributes to this climate of division and hostility.
It's tough out there.
But this story offers a glimmer of hope.
Yeah, a little bit of light.
Suggesting that it's still possible to find common ground.
We can do it.
Even across seemingly insurmountable divides.
It's a reminder that change is possible.
Right.
But it requires a willingness to engage in difficult conversations, to listen with empathy, and to be open to the possibility of transformation.
And it's not just about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations.
Yeah.
Sometimes the most meaningful change happens in small, everyday interactions.
Exactly.
It's about choosing kindness over anger, understanding over judgment, and dialogue over silence.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this incredible story, I want to leave you with this question.
Okay.
How can we, in our own lives, respond with similar grace when faced with prejudice or injustice?
Right.
What small actions can we take to promote understanding and compassion in our communities?
It might not always be easy.
It won't be.
And there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
But as Shaq demonstrated, the impact can be profound.
It changed the world.
It can be daunting to think about tackling these huge issues like systemic racism and prejudice in our daily lives. But like you said, even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think what's so inspiring about this story is that it shows the power of individual choices.
Right.
Shaq could have easily reacted differently with anger, defensiveness, even silence. But he chose a path of grace and engagement.
Right.
And that choice created a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Not just in the store that day,
right,
but in the wider community.
I love how he managed to turn the tables.
Yeah.
And instead of being the target, he became the teacher.
It was a beautiful shift.
It wasn't about lecturing.
Right.
It was about making a genuine connection.
Exactly. He met Mrs. Margaret where she was acknowledging her feelings while gently challenging her perspective. He didn't try to shame her or force her to change her views overnight. He appealed to her humanity, reminding her that we're all connected, regardless of our differences.
It makes you wonder what would have happened if he had reacted differently.
Right. Would she have had that same moment of realization?
Yeah.
It's impossible to say for sure. Right. But I think Shaq's approach created the space for dialogue and reflection.
Right.
It allowed Mrs. Margaret to see him not just as a basketball player or a black man, but as a fellow human being with his own thoughts, feelings, and experiences.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful way to combat prejudice is not through anger, or confrontation, but through empathy and understanding.
It's about building bridges, not walls.
Right, and I think that's the message.
I agree.
We want to leave with our listeners today.
Yeah, that's it.
What kind of bridges can you build in your own life?
Right, think about that.
How can you approach challenging situations with grace, even when it's difficult?
Yeah.
What small acts of kindness and understanding can you extend to others?
Because ultimately, that's what it's all about, right?
Right.
Creating a more just and compassionate world, one interaction at a time.
One interaction at a time.
This isn't about being perfect.
Right.
It's about being willing to learn, to grow, and to make a difference no matter how small.
And who knows, maybe you'll inspire someone else to do the same.
That's the hope. It's a powerful reminder that these kinds of encounters don't always have to end in anger and division.
Right.
There's a real opportunity for growth and understanding.
Yeah.
But it takes conscious effort from both sides.
Absolutely. And this is where we really start to unpack what this story means.
Yeah.
On the surface, it's easy to just focus on Shaq's incredible composure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He was faced with outright racism.
He was.
But never lost his cool.
Right. And instead, he chose to educate and engage.
Right.
And turned a hostile situation into a teachable moment.
Shaq's behavior is a textbook example.
It really is.
Of emotional intelligence in action.
Yeah.
He recognized the emotions welling up, but didn't let them control his actions.
He was aware of them.
Right.
But he didn't let them take over.
Right. He consciously chose a path of empathy and understanding.
Exactly. And that's what ultimately diffused the situation and opened the door for reconciliation.
It makes you think, you know?
Yeah, it really does.
We always have a choice in how we respond to challenging situations.
You always have a choice.
Do we react with anger and escalate things?
Right, lash out.
Or do we try to find a more constructive path?
Right, one that leads to something better.
One that promotes dialogue and understanding.
And it's not always easy.
It's not.
Especially when faced with such blatant prejudice.
Right, but Shaq's response shows us.
It does. It shows us the possibility.
That's possible.
And this brings us to, I think, the second takeaway.
Okay.
The importance of addressing our own biases.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, Mrs. Margaret's initial prejudice might have been unconscious, but it had real-world consequences.
It did.
Her words were hurtful.
Yeah.
They were discriminatory. And they could have easily led to a much worse outcome.
It's a sobering reminder that we all have biases.
We do, every single one of us.
Whether we're aware of them or not.
Whether we realize it or not.
We have a responsibility to examine those beliefs.
We do. We have to do the work.
And challenge the ones that are rooted in prejudice or stereotypes.
It's an ongoing process of self-reflection and education.
We have to be willing to learn and grow.
We do. And sometimes it's uncomfortable.
Even when it's uncomfortable.
But it's necessary.
And Shaq's decision to engage with Mrs. Margaret, to treat her as a human being worthy of respect, is what ultimately led to her change of heart.
It opened her eyes.
He didn't just shut her down.
No, he didn't.
Or dismiss her.
He saw her as a person.
He invited her to see things from a different perspective.
And that's where the real power lies.
I think so.
In this story. It shows us that even deep-seated prejudices can be challenged and overcome.
It's possible.
Through compassion dialogue and genuine listening.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity.
Yes, exactly.
Even in the midst of conflict.
Even when things are tough.
And think about the broader context here.
Okay.
We live in a world
where
these types of encounters are increasingly common.
They happen every day.
Social media, political polarization.
It's everywhere.
It all contributes to this climate of division and hostility.
It creates these barriers between people.
But this story offers a glimmer of hope.
It does a little bit of light.
Suggesting that it's still possible.
It is.
To find common ground.
It is.
Even across seemingly insurmountable divides.
It's a reminder that change is possible.
It is.
But it requires a willingness to engage in difficult conversations.
To have those hard talks.
To listen with empathy.
Yeah, to really hear each other.
And to be open to the possibility of transformation.
And it's not just about...
No, it's not.
Grand gestures or dramatic confrontations.
It's not about those big moments necessarily.
Sometimes the most meaningful change happens in small everyday interactions.
In those little moments.
It's about choosing kindness over anger.
Yes.
Understanding over judgment.
Be open.
And dialogue over silence.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this incredible story,
I
want to leave you with this question.
Right, I'm ready.
How can we, in our own lives, respond with similar grace when faced with prejudice or injustice?
The big question.
What small actions can we take?
Yeah, what can we actually do?
To promote understanding and compassion in our communities.
Right, because it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these problems.
Right. It can feel like our individual actions don't really matter.
But they do.
But they do.
Right.
As Shaq demonstrated, the impact can be profound. It can feel like a lot sometimes, right?
Yeah, totally.
Like, where do you even begin?
Yeah, and it's easy to get discouraged.
Right. It's like, what can one person actually do?
But I think that's why this story is so important.
I agree.
Because it shows us that it really does start with each of us.
It does those individual choices.
Right. Like Shaq could have reacted so differently in that moment.
He could just walked away.
Right. He could have lost his cool.
Right. Or yelled back or...
got defensive.
Exactly. But he chose a different path.
He chose grace.
He chose grace and engagement.
And I think that made all the difference.
I think so, too. It created this ripple effect.
Yeah, and not just in the store that day.
Right. It went beyond that.
It sparked these larger conversations.
And it made people think.
About prejudice, about compassion.
About how we treat each other.
It really became this teachable moment.
And I love how he kind of turned the tables.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of being the target of the racism, he became the teacher.
And it wasn't about lecturing.
Yeah, it wasn't.
It was about making a genuine connection.
Exactly. He met Mrs. Margaret where she was.
Right. Acknowledged her feelings.
Yeah, he didn't dismiss them.
But he challenged her perspective.
Gently, but firmly.
And didn't try to force her to change her views overnight.
No, it's not about that. It's about planting seeds.
Right, and showing her a different way of seeing things.
Appealing to her humanity.
Yeah, reminding her that we're all connected.
We are all part of the same story.
Regardless of our differences.
And it makes you wonder, right?
It does.
What if he had reacted differently?
Right, would she have had that same realization?
Would anything have changed? It's hard to know.
It is.
Yeah.
But I think Shaq's approach created the space.
Agree.
For dialogue and reflection.
Yeah, he opened a door.
He did. He allowed Mrs. Margaret to see him.
Yeah.
Not as a stereotype.
Right, not as just a basketball player.
Or a black man.
But as a human being.
With his own thoughts and feelings and experiences.
God, that's so powerful.
It is. It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective way to combat prejudice
isn't through anger or confrontation, but through empathy and understanding.
Building bridges instead of walls.
Exactly. And that's the message I hope we can leave with our listeners today.
So what kind of bridges can you build in your own life?
Think about that.
How can you approach challenging situations with grace?
Even when it's tough.
What small acts of kindness and understanding?
Yeah, those little things.
Can you extend to others?
Because ultimately that's what it's all about, right?
That's it.
Creating a more just and compassionate world.
One interaction at a time.
One conversation, one smile, one act of kindness at a time.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about.
Exploring those moments that remind us of what's possible when we choose connection over division.
And grace over anger.
Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.